La idea en este momento es básicamente dar la palabra a los profesores Deutsch y Sobak para que nos den, digamos, el concepto, nos retroalimenten con base en la presentación que hizo la doctora Bonilla, entender, digamos, cómo podemos enriquecer este proceso de planeación. Asimismo, si los participantes tienen preguntas, nos las hacen llegar para poder hacerle preguntas tanto a la doctora Bonilla como a los doctores Deutsch y Sobak. Gracias.
It would be hard to overestimate the excellent impression that Senora Bonilla makes on me when she discusses these environmental issues. I would restrict myself to 3 remarks or questions. The first is, will she have the people who are trained and experienced in administering the different regulatory steps that she described? Because I firmly believe that the agenda should not exceed the capacity for prompt and responsible administration. So my second remark is, as Senora Bonilla reviewed all those different aspects on her agenda, there may be a priority issue. Which come first? I implore, third, I implore Senora Bonilla to not use the word best practice without adding the word based on field data. Empty statements of good intention do not replace managing progressive improvement based on measurement. You're fortunate to have Senora Bonilla working on this problem. Thank you.
Let me add just a couple points, and it was gratifying to hear Senora Bonilla recognize the differences that shale gas development bring to environmental impact as opposed to conventional oil and gas. The fact that there are many wells that are going to be drilled, that's often overlooked. Many wells will be drilled as opposed to more singular wells, and the areas covered tend to be extensive and requires regional planning to minimize the impact, whether it's looking at water in a systemic and regional way, as Professor Deutsch introduced this morning, or the number of roads and the number of pipelines. You obviously want to plan this regionally to have the least impact possible, and that seems to be well understood. The second issue, of course, is the new issues with water. We'll talk about seismicity this afternoon, but unlike the produced water in conventional oil and gas, which can just be re-injected and used for pressure maintenance, now we have water coming back after hydraulic fracturing that will have to be disposed of properly. So this is another unique aspect of shale gas development, and it's also well recognized. And the third issue, of course, when you're drilling many wells, is it puts additional emphasis on well construction. And this came up this morning in the question to Professor Deutsch about whether or not there can be methane leakage. Yes, there can be methane leakage, but in 35,000 wells drilled in North America, every case in which there has been methane leakage has been demonstrated to be associated with poor well construction. Inadequate casing, poor cementing. So when you add all of this up, you deal with a whole series of issues that we already understand. We're not talking about fundamental research to understand what these issues are. We understand the issues, and it's just a matter of becoming well organized, putting the right system in place, implementing the system properly, and then adapting the system as more experience and more data become available. And so it's very gratifying to see this comprehensive process that Columbia is engaged in. And in my experience, as well as that of Professor Deutsch, it's very gratifying to see that, because I think it's fairly unique. You're doing a much better job than the other countries who are sort of in the same position you're in with respect to the potential resource available and what you're going to do to address the development as it occurs.
Ok, primero voy a referirme a las preguntas de John Deutsch. Si tenemos suficiente gente capacitada para implementar los pasos regulatorios que planteamos como retos, pues la respuesta es todavía no la tenemos. Siendo sinceros, digamos, el Ministerio de Ambiente acaba de pasar por una reestructuración. El Ministerio de Ambiente se separó de la Agencia Nacional, de la Autoridad Nacional de Licencias Ambientales. El Ministerio de Ambiente tiene entre las funciones la formulación de políticas y regulaciones ambientales que incluyen, como lo decíamos, las normas de agua, de vertimientos, de ruido, de aire, de la gestión integral del suelo como un recurso natural. Entonces, en esta reestructuración, las nuevas direcciones creadas hasta ahora están empezando a asumir algunas de las funciones de esas políticas y otras, digamos en el caso de no hablo por la ANLA, por la Autoridad Nacional de Licencias Ambientales, estoy hablando específicamente del caso del Ministerio de Ambiente. Tendríamos que tener un fortalecimiento importante para poder responder, como lo decía el profesor, si teníamos que no exceda la capacidad, que las regulaciones que vamos a expedir, digamos, no tengan que responder a un cronograma que nos fijamos, sino más bien que sean las más pertinentes y las que seamos capaces de hacerle un efectivo seguimiento. Entonces, sí, tenemos que pensar en esto, se lo planteó también a Orlando Cabrales, de qué manera estos retos que salen de todas estas reflexiones tenemos que ponerlas a consideración de nuestro ministro de Ambiente, ministro de Minas y Energía, para ver cómo vamos a responder a estos retos en los cronogramas que está ya el país esperando en no convencionales. La segunda pregunta se refería, y no estoy segura si entendí bien, a los temas prioritarios que considera John Deutsch por los que debemos empezar.
Your opinion. What are your priorities for you?
Sorry, I don't have a headset. No, I'm kidding. Ya tenemos claro que tenemos que empezar por el tema de vertimientos, establecer unos parámetros y unos estándares de vertimiento. Precisamente hace 10 días estuvimos con la Asociación Colombiana del Petróleo, con el Ministerio de Minas y Energía, con la Autoridad Nacional de Licencias Ambientales y el Ministerio de Ambiente, revisando cuál debería ser el ajuste que debemos introducirle a la propuesta de norma de vertimientos que está, como decía, lista para ser expedida. De hecho, ya está en la revisión de la jurídica del Ministerio, porque el Consejo Técnico Asesor tuvo lugar el 30 de octubre, pero consideramos que si en este momento sale como el proceso no ha sido, digamos, no hemos tenido una sincronización por cómo se han venido dando los talleres de gestión del conocimiento, hasta ahora estamos teniendo una información de línea base que nos permite introducir algunos de estos parámetros en la norma de vertimientos, pero consideramos que si no los introducimos ya, se nos pasa la ventana de oportunidad de varios años. Entonces, agua, o sea, vertimiento de agua es un tema crítico para que ya nos llegó y lo tenemos que decidir. La regulación de aguas, ¿cómo se llaman? Underground, las subterráneas, las aguas subterráneas, se me cruzaron ahora los cables, ya no, ni español ni inglés. Entonces, agua subterránea, ¿cómo vamos a regular el uso del agua subterránea? Es un tema que tenemos que abordar con la Dirección de Gestión Integral de Recurso Hídrico y las corporaciones autónomas regionales. Nos decía el profesor John Deutsch que en Estados Unidos tienen una divergencia entre la regulación estatal y la regulación federal. En Colombia puede pasar algo similar. Acá está el profesor Ramón Leal, el director de Asocars, que de pronto me complementa. Ayer precisamente con el sector eléctrico, con el sector de generación surgió la misma inquietud. El país tiene unas políticas de generación eléctrica que dependen en gran medida del agua, porque pues nuestra matriz energética es hidroeléctrica en su mayoría, el 70%, pero por el otro lado la administración del recurso hídrico se hace a través de permisos por las autoridades regionales, que pueden tener otra expectativa de lo que es la conservación y el uso del recurso, o por medio de las concesiones de agua. Mientras no tengamos clara esa armonía que debe haber entre la política energética, en este caso de hidrocarburos, o sea, un sector que vemos va a necesitar para los no convencionales una fuerte disponibilidad de recurso hídrico, y tenemos por el otro lado una apuesta de conservación del recurso hídrico que se hace como la gestión integral a partir de los recursos naturales renovables, que lo lidera en política el Ministerio de Ambiente, pero en la práctica, en la gestión del recurso como tal, la administración la hacen las autoridades ambientales regionales. Pues tenemos que tener clara esa película, y nuevamente creo que es un tema prioritario ver cómo se va a manejar las concesiones de agua y cómo hacemos para optimizar y minimizar usando, de pronto reciclando agua, como nos lo presentó uno de los expertos que vino hace 3 semanas. Usan el agua residual de un municipio, le quitan el problema al municipio, y ese es el agua que usan para hacer el fracking, y posteriormente esa agua ya la recirculan para hacer fracking y seguir haciendo la explotación de los pozos. Entonces creo que se nos pone un reto importante con respecto a la disponibilidad del recurso hídrico. El otro tema sería el tema social, comunitario, de qué manera la Agencia Nacional de Hidrocarburos y a través de los operadores tiene que tener unas políticas mucho más contundentes de gestión social para poder manejar desde la prevención los conflictos sociales que se pueden generar por esta. Nos comentaban los señores que en Pensilvania, en esos pueblitos chiquitos tuvo el mismo impacto. Acá la diferencia va a ser pues que son comunidades rurales campesinas, que son las que pues van a estar sufriendo esa afluencia de vehículos, de personal extraño, de cambio en las mismas costumbres, en fin. Y el tema me parece clave, lo que el profesor Sobak nos decía, con respecto a las normas que desde el sector minero, desde el sector energético tienen que venir, no sé si son normas que establece el Ministerio de Minas y Energía acerca de la tecnología de cementación, de completación de pozos, porque ahí está en gran medida la prevención que habría de generar posibles contingencias a futuro. Bueno, me señala acá que no me refería a la tercera pregunta, que me pide que no usemos la palabra mejores prácticas sin generar información de campo. Entonces acá, como decíamos en la presentación, la generación de conocimiento tiene que partir también de hacer que la industria, los operadores generen la información que vamos a requerir para poder mejorar continuamente las prácticas que utilicemos en este tipo de proyectos. De manera, como decía él, que no sean simplemente palabras vagas que se las lleve el viento, sino hechos concretos con indicadores, que será lo que consideremos mejores prácticas en el futuro.
May I ask a clarification about what you mean by water discharge regulations? Does water discharge also include the possibility of just discharging it to the local streams and areas? Is that something which is permitted?
En Colombia la práctica ha sido, y la regulación lo que establece es regulación para vertimiento a cuerpos de agua naturales, o sea, sí es una práctica en Colombia.
So I always like to make myself look like a radical environmentalist. I welcome this opportunity. I think that there should be zero discharge of flowback or produced water into the streams and fields. Full stop. Now, notice that I recommend that at the outset as a simple regulation for unconventional oil and gas. I don't propose that you marry that for conventional oil and gas production, which shows, in my view, the wisdom of starting with unconventional oil and gas suitable to the technology where there's massive amounts of produced water. But I would think it would be very unfortunate to say we're going to allow some open discharge and try and bring that back later on.
Bueno, y con respecto entonces, yo les hago ahora la pregunta a ellos dos. El tema de reinyección es algo que nos comprometimos a estudiar con la ANLA y entre la ANLA y el Ministerio de Ambiente, porque fue precisamente un planteamiento que nos hizo la industria y el sector hace 15 días. Es decir, la norma colombiana, como está prevista, permite un periodo de transición para las empresas o los operadores que propongan un plan de reconversión a tecnologías más limpias. Lo que debemos estudiar muy rápidamente, se lo comentaba Ana Cristina, es cuáles son las condiciones técnicas que permitirían la reinyección en Colombia. Pues el profesor nos está diciendo que la norma debe ser 0 descargas a cuerpos superficiales, luego la opción sería reinyección. ¿Cuáles son las condiciones técnicas que debe cumplir la reinyección? ¿Qué tan pronto podemos hacer un estudio serio, técnicamente sustentado, para entender las condiciones bajo las cuales la reinyección podría ser considerada una tecnología aceptable desde lo ambiental? Y también preguntarle al profesor Sobak el tema de microsismicidad inducida por cuenta de enormes volúmenes reinyectados de agua de descarga, de producción y de overflow.
Okay, so let me address the issue of reinjection in a general way. You know, the United States has a long history of oil and gas production, And in many old oil fields, there's a lot of water that's co-produced with the oil. Some of it's re-injected into the oil reservoir, but some of it has to be disposed of. So from this source and many other sources, there has been a very strong need for the injection of water in the United States for many decades. There are currently approximately 150,000 licensed injection wells operating in the United States. The way these wells are regulated is that they are regulated in accordance with EPA guidelines as introduced by Professor Deutsch, and the regulation is then done in collaboration with local and state regulatory agencies. So there's a partnership, but often they don't agree, and that's an issue to be addressed. So this process of wastewater injection has been going on successfully throughout the country for many decades in literally 150,000 wells. Now, I'll discuss the parameters that control whether or not there'll be an occurrence of triggered seismicity. So let me put that issue aside for now, because we're going to go into it at length after lunch. But in general, the requirements for injection wells are that the injecting interval is isolated from the near surface, right? You want to put the wastewater away, and you don't want it interacting with fresh water that might be used for irrigation or domestic use of some sort. And you want to find geologic formations that can accept the injected water at the rate at which you're injecting it without excessive pressure buildup. So the fact is, some parts of the country have excellent formations for re-injection, and other parts do not. And this actually sets the stage for the discussion this afternoon, because in Texas, there are 55,000 or so permitted injection wells. They use a fractured limestone at depth, something called the Ellenberger Formation. This limestone is very regionally extensive, it's very porous, it's very permeable, and this has been used for the injection of wastewater associated with the oil and gas industry for many decades with no problem whatsoever. In the last few years, there are a few places where the local injection rate increased because of the need to dispose of flowback water from shale gas, and in these places there have been a few earthquakes occurring. So you have to match the injection rate to the capacity of the formation being used for the injection, and I'll talk about that more this afternoon. But the point I'm trying to make in general is that in some areas the geology will present formations, geologic formations, which are ideal for injection, and we have many examples in the United States where safe injection of wastewater from many different sources has been safely disposed of through re-injection for many decades. An opposite example is the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, a couple years ago, had 9, not 90, not 900, not 9,000, 9 permitted injection wells compared to 55,000 in Texas, simply because there were no geologic formations that could accept large quantities of wastewater. They were not laterally extensive, they were not porous and permeable enough, and therefore when shale gas development began in Pennsylvania, the first thing that was done is that the water was all taken in trucks west to the state of Ohio, where the geology was better. There were more injection wells available, and the water was injected there, which was expensive, caused a lot of traffic, and was totally unacceptable for all sorts of reasons. So this led the shale gas industry to simply recycle and reuse the water in Pennsylvania because there were no good options for reinjection. So I'll mention that again this afternoon, but we have to adapt what is done to the conditions that present themselves, and where sufficient geologic formations for reinjection are available, reinjection is a viable option, and where those geologic formations do not exist, we have to come up with other options such as reuse of the water. I would say that in Pennsylvania, the requirements for surface water disposal, to put the water into a stream or lake, are so severe that there is no treated water being injection. It would be enormously expensive and difficult to meet the high environmental quality standards. And I'm not saying that the environmental quality standards should be relaxed. I'm just saying it's a fact that the water has to be disposed of in other ways to be practical, which is now being reused and reinjected for hydraulic fracturing in the next shale gas well that's being drilled.
Is there other questions coming up here?
Queremos dar la palabra al doctor Rodrigo Suárez, que va a hacer pues algunos comentarios por parte de la ANLA.
Buenos días. Digamos, frente al tema de capacidad profesional, digamos que durante el último año hemos venido haciendo diversos ejercicios al interior de la entidad para, digamos, mejorar esa capacidad. Pero uno de los problemas que hemos identificado es que no es un problema, como lo mencionaba la señora Bonilla, sino es un tema un poco más amplio. Estamos viendo que a nivel nacional, digamos, desde las universidades, digamos, no se están generando profesionales o no se están generando maestrías o doctorados o especializaciones relacionadas con algunos temas digamos, de importancia nacional actualmente. Podemos estar hablando del tema de no convencionales, en el tema de hidrocarburos. Si nos pasamos al tema de minería, podríamos estar teniendo también situaciones con minería subterránea, temas de geología, geotecnia, geoquímica. Si pasamos en el tema de vías, vamos a tener temas también asociados con geología, asociados a túneles. Digamos que estamos viendo que hay una gran necesidad actualmente, digamos, de nuevos profesionales, de nuevas especializaciones, de nuevas consideraciones específicas. Si bien en los últimos años sí hemos venido a nivel nacional, digamos, mejorando nuestra capacidad de algunos profesionales y profesiones, sí, sin duda alguna, creo que el país tiene que hacer un esfuerzo muy grande, seguramente a través del Ministerio de Educación, para fortalecer esa capacidad. Y eso es quizás algo de lo que presentaba ahorita Marcela en la presentación, y es uno de los esfuerzos grandes que estamos haciendo a nivel gobierno con la industria y con la academia para efectos de montar digamos, un centro de investigación que nos permita tener esas capacidades que vayan un poco más allá digamos, de estos foros, sino que podamos tener todo un proceso de gestión del conocimiento que nos permita a aquellos que estamos hoy y a aquellos que van a estar en un futuro muy cercano, digamos, trabajando en estos temas. Y creo que el doctor Deutsch hablaba de ese aspecto, es generar unas capacidades de esos profesionales técnicos que sean aquellos que estén mandando en su momento temas específicos, bien sea agua, aire, el tema de sismicidad, de reinyección, el tema de pozos, completamiento de pozos y todos los procesos asociados a. Eso es como uno de los principales comentarios. Quisiéramos, no sé si pasar un poco alguna de las preguntas que tenemos aquí. Hay una que pareciera que estuviera dirigida a la ANLA, pero vamos a formularla de una manera para recibir los aportes de ustedes. ¿Cómo verían, digamos, que existen procesos de solicitud de permisos relacionados con el tema de no convencionales, y qué ¿qué decisión tomarían ustedes frente? Hay unas solicitudes, pero no hay una normatividad. ¿Qué decisión tomarían ustedes?
Let me take both. I don't know whether this is on or not. I make two remarks. Far be it from me, a professor, not to, and a former government official, not to support the need to build qualified individuals, engineers, and others in the whole range of environmental science questions that come up. And I want to firmly say that I think that's important, certainly in my country and here. But the absence cannot be used as an excuse not to move forward. It should influence the pace at which one moves forward, the selectivity of what you decide to regulate, and it would form the simplicity of the regulation. Emphasizing strongly, as I said before, that it would change over time. So while you may have severe, like Pennsylvania had at the beginning, you must begin a program of getting stronger in it, but proceed selectively. Second question you ask is, would you grant permits if you didn't have any regulations yet formulated and adopted, even of the simple nature that I'm advocating as a beginning? No. No. You can't begin this process by letting there be wide experimentation with no rules. It's not good for the public, and it's not good for the companies, because it doesn't signal to the companies what will be expected. And third point is, there's no rush. That is, I'm not saying wait 2 years or wait, but the starting point cannot happen before there is some understanding of the framework and the content of regulations which are going to apply to unconventional oil and gas.
Let me excuse me. Let me address the capacity building question about training at universities. There's some things the United States does very well, and a few things we do very poorly in that regard, and we can take advantage of what happens in other countries. At many universities in the United States, we have an excellent relationship between private industry and the universities. And through that process, we educate the future employees for the industry. This is certainly true at Stanford University. We're a famous research university. The first professor hired at Stanford over 100 years ago was a mining engineer. We've always worked closely with industry. We do today. The students work on fundamental research. They work on fundamental research while at the university, but through that process, they become aware of what happens in industry and become prepared to take positions with industry. And I don't know the degree to which that's happening in Colombia, but I'm sure it could be enhanced. And it's something that serves both the universities very well and serves industry very well. And you do not have to sacrifice the quality of the work. You do not have to sacrifice the fundamental nature of the research in order to have a close working relationship with industry. And I think the same is true at MIT and other universities in the United States. One thing we do very poorly in the United States, but they do very well in Norway, is they have active training programs for the general workers in the oil and gas industry in we call it a junior college or a community college system, more or less a 2-year program following high school, not a full college education. And what this tends to do is it gives the people working in the oil industry in Norway a much broader view of what's happening around them. So that if your job happens to be to work on cementing of casing, that's not the only thing you know. Through this 2-year community college program, you've been introduced to many other aspects of the oil and gas industry. It makes the employee better because they can move into other positions more easily. But also, when it comes to health and safety, they understand what they're doing and how important it is for the overall goals of the project. And I think this is something which the US would benefit from if we adopted, and the Norwegians are already doing. And so I think there's training both at the university level to prepare the next generation of geologists, geophysicists, and engineers to go into industry. And I think there's opportunities at the pre-college level or the community college level for the general workers in the industry. And I think it benefits the workforce, it benefits the companies, and frankly, in the end, it benefits the environment because everybody is a more well-informed employee.
Aló. Tenemos un par de preguntas adicionales. El desarrollo de los yacimientos no convencionales es un proceso de aprendizaje. ¿Cuál es la recomendación o el mecanismo de trabajo entre las autoridades y la industria para lograr la exploración y desarrollo de los yacimientos no convencionales?
If I understand this question properly, it's an issue about how does one harmonize the level of understanding of both theory and practice between the companies that are out there and between government officials. And the answer is that is extremely important. And I would like to offer 2 observations about this. Our committee, and I ask Professor Zobak not to contradict me on this point, favored the establishment of a general laboratory sponsored for the whole industry, producing measurable best practices in order to spread that to the different companies. In point of fact, the industry took a different path, which is to have regional associations, which was not dedicated to technical development of best practices based on measurement, but rather which served as a forum to assure that industry operators in the region, local interest parties, and local regulators were exchanging information in order to spread the knowledge as quickly as possible. And I think that that has been a step forward. It is the right, at least first step for proceeding.
I completely agree. Now, the committee was actually quite disappointed. You know, we were hoping to see that the process of organizing for best practice would generate local places where the local problems could be discussed in detail, whether it was water or traffic or air pollution or noise, and where the public and industry and regulators would all work together to understand the problems and reduce them. And also be a place where the public could get information about what was what was happening, and our hopes were that these would sprout up. Other things have been done.
Una pregunta para los profesores es, en cuanto a reuso del agua, reutilización, reciclaje, ¿para qué actividades? O sea, el agua puede provenir de actividades, como decíamos, de pronto de unas aguas residuales municipales y ser utilizada para el fracturamiento, la perforación. Y también la misma pregunta, ¿el agua puede ser tratada hasta cierto nivel que pueda ser utilizada en la agricultura, o eso es algo totalmente, es demasiado costoso tratar esa agua a partir del flowback y de las aguas de formación para que puedan tener otro uso?
Let me address the second question first. In the state of Wyoming, in the western United States, there's been coal bed methane produced for several decades. It was alluded to this morning in Professor Deutsch's presentation. In coal bed methane, the methane is actually adsorbed to the coal. You can think of it as little bubbles just attached to the coal. The way you get the gas to come out is you pump water out of the coal, and when the water pressure drops, the bubbles come off and then flow into the well. So you have to dispose of this water that you're producing. Now imagine in this state of Wyoming, kind of a large state, and Powder River Basin is more or less in the middle. In the southern part of this basin, the water quality coming from the coal is so pure that it is used as drinking water by the city of Gillette, a sizable local town. The water quality is just fine. So it's produced water to produce natural gas, and the water quality is perfect. In the center part of the Powder River Basin, the water has a little bit of salinity and has a high ratio of sodium to other cations. It's called the sodium absorption ratio, SAR. This makes the water unusable for drinking, but still usable for irrigation if they mix it with fresh water, or if they use some amendments. The farmers put gypsum on the field, and that water, when reacting with the gypsum, is fine for irrigation. So it's fine. By the time you get to the northern part of the basin, at the border with Montana, there is so much salt, selenium, arsenic in the water, it can't be used for anything and has to be re-injected safely. In fact, Montana has had a ban on coal bed methane because the water quality there is just so bad, and they just don't even want it coming to the surface even to re-inject it. So it really depends on the circumstance and the quality of the water, whether it can be used even for drinking water or can't be used at all and has to be completely disposed of in a safe way. Now, the idea of using municipal wastewater for hydraulic fracturing, I think in principle is just fine. I think it's problematic to be a practical solution. And that's because the points where you need the water, where you're drilling, are moving around over time, and you'd have to make the water available to different sites at different times. You'd be trucking a lot of water. Whether the water would be available in sufficient quantity, the cost of treating the water to the point that it could be safely handled by the workers, and so on. So maybe that's practical, maybe it's not. It would have to be considered on a case-by-case basis. But one of the amazing things is the use of saline water, water that's already so salty that it has no practical use. And there are many places where saline water is being used for drilling, and it's being used for hydraulic fracturing. And everyone here has seen pictures of those cases. And the picture I have in mind is an offshore platform. Every well that's drilled offshore is drilled with salt water. If it's hydraulically fractured, it's hydraulically fractured with salt water. Nobody's hauling fresh water out to offshore platforms in order to drill wells. The reason industry doesn't do this routinely is there are some complications. Obviously, the water could be more corrosive. You have to use different additives. But industry has been dealing with salt water for many, many decades and knows how to do it. So when water is in short supply, fresh water is in short supply, saline water is available, and even sometimes because you're drilling deeply into a saline aquifer to acquire this water, whatever flows back out of the well after hydraulic fracturing can be re-injected into that same saline aquifer, and the freshwater system is never impacted whatsoever. So there are many options available, and we simply have to adapt to the quality of the water and the geologic circumstances, and of course the economics to find the solution that's most practical.
I would like to make two small additions here. The first is, in many areas, for example, Pennsylvania, a very significant fraction of the produced water is immediately recycled for re-injection into the next well. That means that you don't continually have to provide fresh water for the activity, and in some sense you are concentrating the salts which you bring out of the formation in the produced water in successive re-injections, recycling of the water into successive re-injections. That can be done up to a point. It can be done up to a point when at a certain stage the salt concentration gets too high, but it does depend upon there being a increasing population of new wells being drilled to make use of that recycling opportunity. Very important so far in many areas of the United States. How far you can go with it is a question. Secondly, there is a wide understanding, both in industry and in a whole set of other technology type people, that improvements in water purification, both for unconventional oil and gas and more generally around the world, is a very important technology objective, a very important technology target. So I see dozens and dozens of proposals for cleaning up the water, either to the point where it's completely potable or to the point where it's used for agricultural or other uses, come before me at MIT by many, many quite interesting and sophisticated young people. So I do believe we're going to see a significant improvement over time in the ability to manage this water purification or water cleanup problem. But it's not there yet. So this is another one of those areas that over time I think needs to get better, and there's technology, I think, on the way to help us with that.
Ok, muchas gracias a los tres. Tenemos que parar en este momento, tenemos más preguntas, pero va a haber oportunidad en la tarde de resolverlas. Queremos invitarlos entonces a pasar al almuerzo que está en el salón exactamente de enfrente. Les hemos pedido que devuelvan las USBs que se les entregaron al principio porque necesitamos actualizar algunas de las presentaciones. Quienes lo no hayan hecho, les agradecemos las entreguen a las personas de protocolo. Estamos regresando aquí a la 1:15, por favor, gracias.
I think it's